These vile anti-Semites, they're the exact same people who've been lecturing us all for years about race and gender and climate and equity and all the rest of it. It's the same movement. Hello everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. I want to start today with the big story. It's pretty disturbing. We're going to get to some interesting other things today, especially we're going to do a deep dive with Susan Shelley on this very important Supreme Court ruling, which is being described as the answer to the homelessness crisis that has swept America, particularly the West Coast here in California, places like Washington. But I do want to start with these awful scenes from Columbia University in New York. The videos really capture the horrific specter now stalking our land here in America, especially our university campuses, which is the specter of virulent anti-Semitism. There's no other way of describing it. Some people say, well, it's not really anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism, because what they're really against is the behavior of the Jewish state. They're not against the Jewish state. And even if they are against the Jewish state, well, that's a political argument, and they're going back to what they consider to be the unfairness of how it was founded and how Palestinians were treated in late 1940s and all the rest of it. And so it's not anti-Semitic. It's not against Jewish people. It's against the Jewish state and the way it behaves. And it's anti-Zionist. That's what you hear, and we have been hearing for months now, ever since these disgusting protests erupted. But here's a video that really gives the lie to all of that.
You have a culture. You be creative. All you do is colonize. That's it. Who is here first? You're first.
Stop killing children.
They're saying it's not anti-Semitism. What were they saying? Go back to Poland. Go back to Poland. Go back to Europe. So what's that got to do with anything that the government of Israel is doing or not doing? No. Go back to Poland is incredibly clear. You are Jewish. We don't want you here. Go back to Poland. Go back to Europe. Get out. Why? Because you're Jewish. Got nothing. That's not a protest against the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu or anything else. And by the way, they're making this argument on what day? The first day of Passover. And you have a Jewish leader on campus saying, sorry, Jewish students should go home because we cannot guarantee your safety on campus. What is this other than absolutely clear anti-Semitism? No longer can these protesters hide behind this false argument that it's actually a legitimate policy grievance with the Israeli government. No, it is absolutely clear now what is going on in this country is anti-Semitism. And the universities are the absolute epicenter of it, but it's spreading way beyond that. And you talk to any Jewish person in America now, and they will tell you the same, and tell you that this has been going on since October the 7th, and they've been telling us that it's anti-Semitism, and you have the media and all these politicians, and particularly the Democrats, covering up and saying, no, it's anti-Zionism. And by the way, those politicians, they're encouraging it. Why are they encouraging it, despite their words? And you see condemnation from Biden and Schumer and all these people about what's going on in Colombia. Those words aren't worth the paper they're written on or the devices that they're typed on. Because as the months have gone on and the Biden administration and the Democrats and the media have turned on Israel, that has encouraged all of this. It's encouraged this vile anti-Semitism. And now you're seeing their political demonization of Israel's behavior, defending against the attacks, the gruesome attacks on their country, morph into this disgusting anti-Semitism. It's all part of the same story. It legitimizes it. When you see the media and the Democrat politicians, and yes, some on the right as well, condemning Israel now, condemning Israel after what happened to them. What's now Israel is the aggressor here. Absolutely disgusting. That fans the flames of this anti-Semitism. And then, I mean, again, if you just look at what these people are saying. Hamas, you make us proud. Take another soldier out. Burn Tel Aviv to the ground. Hamas, we love you. We support your rockets. I mean, what is going on? This is a university in America. Well, apparently, we're supposed to think one of our greatest universities. And the students there are doing this? Hamas, you make us proud. The people who raped and butchered Israelis, you make us proud? What is going on that they feel empowered and enabled to chant this stuff in public with no sanction? And look at the response of the authorities. Yes, they're trying to do something about it, but guess who they're punishing? The Jewish professor who's leading the protests against this. He had his credentials removed at Columbia. I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable that this is happening. And then the final video, I mean, there's so many videos out there, but watch this, because it really tells you something about what's going on here.
Repeat after me. We have Zionists. Who have entered the camp. We are going to create a human chain. Where I am standing. So that. They do not pass this point. And infringe upon our privacy. And try to disrupt our community. One step forward. Another step forward.
So to me, that ridiculous, embarrassing of the call and response, like they're members of some brainwashed cult, which is basically what they are. The overwhelming thought I had when I saw that, just how stupid these people are, just dumb sheep, chanting these ridiculous, embarrassing responses to the guy who's leading the chants. They just come across as these absolute idiots, just dumb, stupid people who've just been fed nonsense, and now they're spewing it out into the world. Think about the stupidity. And then remember that these people who are doing this on our campuses, this obscene anti-Semitism, this obscene support for Hamas, we love your rockets, take another soldier out. These are the exact same people, it's the exact same political movement who for years they've been pushing this far left ideology on a whole bunch of other issues. It's the same people behind the climate extremism, the race and gender extremism, all this far left madness that we've been seeing in our country. This is where it's coming from, our universities, and these are the people who are pushing it. So now we see them in their true colors. These vile anti-Semites, these Jew haters who are chanting, "Go back to Poland." They're the exact same people who've been lecturing us all for years about race and gender and climate and equity and all the rest of it. It's the same movement, the far left ideology that has captured our universities, and then ever since the summer of George Floyd has increasingly captured elite institutions beyond our universities. It's the same movement. It's the same far left madness. And now we see it in its true colors, and that should inspire all of us to take a stand against it before it does even more damage to the social fabric of our country. All right, for California Corner today, guess what? We have got a bonus for you because we have both of our regular guests together in the same show. In a moment, Jen Horn talking about the latest, and that word is appropriate, amazingly, the latest break-in, the latest home invasion for Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, and what that tells us about what's going on with crime in the city of Los Angeles. But first, we've got Susan Shelley, because there's a really important issue, and I've been looking at this issue and looking at the conversation around it, and I keep coming back to this point. I want to talk to Susan Shelley about it because I bet she can help us understand. The issue is a big one, not just for California, but for the whole country. And I don't know exactly when you'll be listening to this episode, but this week, we're taping this on Monday, the 22nd of April, just after oral arguments at the Supreme Court in an incredibly important case relating to the biggest and most visible example of democratic failure in our state, which is homelessness, the homelessness crisis that has gone on for years and years and years. And as we saw the other week, billions and billions of dollars spent only for the problem to get worse. Now, one thing that keeps coming up is this particular case. Two cases, actually. First of all, the Boise ruling we keep hearing about. That was from 2018, Boise in Idaho, which was used to argue that cities would not be allowed to clear people from the streets who are camping, who are breaking local laws in terms of camping on the streets and in public places and parks and so on, unless they had adequate shelter to provide them. And then you had another case, and this is the one that's at the Supreme Court today, Grants Pass versus Oregon. And this is the one that we are told will finally, if it goes the right way, and we'll know that at the end of the session of the Supreme Court in June, if they rule the right way, then finally the cities and the counties and the states can finally get to grips with the homelessness crisis. So there's a certain amount of truth in it, but my gut instinct is that actually they've all been hiding behind these legal rulings, and the story is a little bit more complicated than we're being told. So who better to explain all that than Susan Shelley, who of course has been following all of this. Susan, I'll hand it over to you. Tell us what you think about this issue and where it goes from here.
Well, the central issue is who is going to decide what the cities can and can't do when they're enforcing their health and safety laws. Will it be the state constitution that controls? Will it be the federal courts overseeing the states and the cities? That's really the central issue here. And the situation with the homelessness cases goes back really to 2007 when the city of Los Angeles settled a lawsuit by the ACLU, and they agreed to let people sleep on the sidewalk between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. anywhere in the city until a certain amount of housing was built. The housing was built, but they never went to court to say, okay, we're done with this settlement, we're going to start enforcing. They never would do that. And in the interim, there was this case in Idaho. The settlement in the Jones versus Los Angeles case said it would not be a precedent. What the Ninth Circuit had said would not be a precedent in that case. But then they took all the reasoning from the Jones case, put it in the Martin versus Boise decision, and it did become a precedent. So what it said is that cities could not enforce an anti-camping ordinance until they had enough shelter beds for everyone. Undefined. And then there were more decisions from the courts saying, well, this is enough shelter beds, but they're not adequate, or they're not adequate for everybody, or they're not close enough, or whatever the situation. So cities have been sued and sued and sued, and these cases all go to the federal courts. The Martin versus Boise case is from the Ninth Circuit. It affects the western states. Finally, the Supreme Court took this case from Grants Pass, Oregon, which had to do with civil penalties, citations for camping in a park. And now what they're deciding is, do the federal courts have to oversee every single one of these cases, or are they all going to come back as lawsuits? In other words, is there a constitutional principle that the cities and states can be held to enforce? Or is this just case by case and everybody can be sued in every city? It all goes back to Robinson versus California in 1962, which was the case that said the cruel and unusual punishments clause of the Eighth Amendment applies to the states too. Most people don't know this, but the Bill of Rights originally applied only to the federal government, and it began to apply to the states piece by piece starting in 1925, not with the Civil War and the 14th Amendment in 1868, but after everybody who did that was dead and couldn't say anything about it, in 1925, the Supreme Court started this project of piece by piece applying these rules to the states. The Bill of Rights binds the states. But it's balancing tests all the time, and it's case by case all the time, and it's been quite a mess. So today they were discussing, are they going to reverse Robinson versus California, which would unsettle a lot of laws, or are they going to find some other way to allow cities to enforce anti-camping? They were discussing the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, a necessity defense, other ways to do it besides declaring that there's a constitutional right to camp in the park if you're homeless. Very interesting how this is going to play out.
So amazing. Thank you for that. I mean, that background is not in any of the coverage. It's exactly why I wanted to talk to you about this today. So let's put aside the question of federal versus state and just look at the states here, right? And particularly in California, because they keep saying, well, there's nothing we can do to clear people off the streets because of these rulings. And the rulings say you can't enforce the law unless you have adequate shelter. But as you said, that's not defined in any of these rulings. So the part of this that I want you to dig into with us now, Susan, is it depends on how you define shelter. So actually, even if you have a really large number of people, as you do in big cities like, let's just say, Los Angeles, the worst, actually, you could provide shelter at an affordable rate if it's, for example, a sort of temporary structure with beds, like we see it sometimes in emergencies and so on. That doesn't take too long. We've seen them being thrown up, during COVID, the hospitals, those kinds of things, right? So you could do that, and there's nothing stopping you doing that except the activists, the homelessness activists in all these places, the homeless industrial complex, if we got to know it, say, well, actually, no, that doesn't count. We won't accept that, as that's not shelter. The only thing that qualifies as shelter is a permanent home or apartment or whatever it may be. Just talk about that aspect of this.
Definitely. There's a lot of money to be made in developing buildings with government loans, grants, set-asides, overrides, things that don't have CEQA requirements for environmental review. There's a lot of money to be made in that. And those developers donate a lot of money to politicians because the politicians control where those buildings are built and who can build them and all the rest of it. They don't make any money on a temporary shelter. They don't make any money if the city were to buy RVs, mobile homes, manufactured housing, and set up a city of temporary shelter. That doesn't make the developers any money. And so what they want to do is build apartments. And that's what you're seeing. Homeless encampments that are allowed to remain until, quote, we have enough housing. It's not workable. In Santa Monica, California, they have just approved a project that's $1 million a unit for homeless housing. Really? How is that sustainable? It's just not. And the state of California has put in recent years $24 billion into homelessness programs. They don't even know where the money went. They're buying hotels at top dollar, refurbishing them with top dollar labor. Incredible amounts of money being spent. There's no end to the problem because there's no requirement for anyone to get well or to seek services or to seek treatment, so people can just do drugs in the subsidized or free housing. It's unsustainable. And yet everybody in politics is making money off of it, so they don't really care.
Would you go so far as to say that this grants pass debate and the ruling and this whole legal process, it's almost irrelevant, that actually if you had the will and the determination to stand up to the interests of all kinds, whether that's far left homeless activists and advocates or the crony developers, you could deal with the problem. There's nothing in the law that stops you, because you could say, yeah, we're going to take you off the streets, we're going to put you in temporary shelter, and we're going to get you treatment and services. What's stopping that from happening today?
Nothing is stopping that from happening. Although there have been some lawsuits because the law is so muddy coming out of the Ninth Circuit. There have been some lawsuits over whether the shelters are adequate, if they don't take pets, if they're not immediately in the same community. Quite a bit of discussion in the Supreme Court oral arguments about what would be considered a regional solution, where there might be homeless shelters in the next city over. And some of the activists have argued, well, that's not good enough because then they can't live in their community. But there isn't really a right under the Constitution to live wherever you choose, regardless of your ability to pay for it. And if they're going to create that right in a Supreme Court decision, it's going to have some unintended consequences that we're going to have to deal with for a long time.
I mean, you just don't have this problem in other countries. I mean, it's just not, I mean, of course you have homelessness everywhere, but there's something going on here that just doesn't add up to me. And I mean, or on the other side of the country. I mean, okay, you say the Ninth Circuit applies to the Western states. I mean, you go to Florida, yes, there are homeless people, but not like this. New York, not like this. I mean, it's bad in New York, but it's nothing like what you see in California.
Interesting you should mention Florida. One of the cases they discussed today was the Papa Christou case from around the same time in the 1960s, I believe. And this was Jacksonville, Florida. They had an anti-vagrancy ordinance on the books, and it was very specific. It listed all the things that define what is being a vagrant that are not legal, and this was a misdemeanor offense. And the Supreme Court threw out that law as being unconstitutionally vague. It was very specific. It prohibited being drunk in public and having no legitimate business where you are. It listed in a long paragraph all the things that made up the condition that they were trying to allow the police to do something about. It was thrown out for vagueness. And the people in Jacksonville tried to pass another one that was trying to be even more specific, but basically they were told that you can't give the police discretion. Wandering from place to place, one of the justices said, is like what the poet Walt Whitman wrote about. Well, this is not really what we're discussing, is what the poet just... And one of the justices today said, if I fall asleep on the beach under a blanket, you would prosecute me for sleeping in public. Well, no, they wouldn't. So it gets to the point where I think it was the Chief Justice today who said, why should these 9 people be making these decisions for this community in Grants Pass, Oregon? And that gets to the incorporation doctrine, the idea that the federal courts oversee all state law through the Bill of Rights, applying, which they did themselves, that wasn't the original plan, applying to the states, and then the federal courts will adjudicate every single one of these things, except obviously they can't. So the states are left at the risk of being sued for whatever they do. That's where we are right now.
And the other part of this is, why should the courts be so, getting involved in such micromanagement of a policy area? I mean, you don't see this in other areas of policy. I mean, let's just say you ran for statewide office here in California, and you said, right, we're going to deal with this problem, and we're going to do it in a humane and compassionate way. Most of the people who are living on the streets, they need mental health care, and they need drug addiction care, and they need all this. We've talked about this endlessly, right? That's what they need, as well as somewhere clean and safe to live. So, and this is something that, for example, Leighton Woodhouse, who works with Michael Schellenberger, he's advocated, which is the best place to get someone clean and sober and back on track for the kind of life we would want for someone is actually away from the city, somewhere, away. Actually, the point of being away from the community, contrary to these advocates, is really helpful because you can clean up. And so what if we put something together which is on an emergency basis, 100,000 places dispersed in places throughout the state, and give people, but cheap, shelter, and just did it. You ran for office on that platform and you just did it. Why should the courts have any say over that? It's a policy matter that affects everybody, not just the people themselves, but the communities where this is all going on. What is the basis for the court? And someone bringing a lawsuit? I mean,
the basis is, at some point, if someone doesn't want to go into those services, into those facilities, at some point there's compulsion. And at some point it's a crime, a misdemeanor, a civil violation. At some point it's something.
Which is the crime? Making them do it is a crime.
Well, if let's say they say that pitching a tent in a public park in Grants Pass, Oregon, is against the law.
Yeah.
And they enforce that law, and this person goes to the ACLU and they file a lawsuit against the city saying, this person's homeless, it's cold outside, you can't say, because this person is homeless, that's a status, that's not an action, and it's a condition of being human that they need sleep and they have to be warm, and therefore this law is unconstitutional, or unconstitutional as it's applied in this case. And that's how it gets into the courts. So the question is, what's the constitutional right exactly? Is there there's a constitutional right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, but is it cruel and unusual punishment to cite someone and direct them into services? Is that cruel and unusual punishment? What some of the justices were saying today is the community is really just trying to tell people to move somewhere else. So they're creating this situation of perpetual citation and racking up these fines, and it becomes such an unworkable situation that the people just feel harassed and leave. And some of the justices were saying that that is unconstitutional. Is it? Under
Right. So
what
let's dig into. I
provision?
just
Under
want.
what provision of the Constitution is it
Yeah.
unconstitutional?
So is that what the arguments are about as well? Not just the federal state thing, but what is the definition of cruel and unusual punishment in this case? Is the case about that at all?
It is if they decided under the Eighth Amendment. In the Robinson versus California case, what they decided was that a California law that said it's illegal to be addicted to drugs was unconstitutional because that being an addict was a status. It was not an action. Someone had been arrested who was not at the moment using drugs but had track marks on his arm, and he was arrested for being a drug user. And they said, no, can't do that. The Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment prohibits this California law. And so that became a precedent for the whole country that you can't have a law criminalizing a status. Big discussion at the court today, is it a status to be homeless? Because you can go in and out of it. If you're in a shelter, you're not homeless. And then maybe the next night you leave the shelter and you are homeless. What exactly is homeless? And what is the right of a person to be in a particular community? If, let's say, they come from another state and they settle in Grants Pass and they're in the park with a tent, homeless, do they have that right? Is that a status that is protected under the Constitution? Very muddy water here. And this is because of the incorporation doctrine saying that the Bill of Rights applies to the states and therefore the federal courts oversee the enforcement of these different laws. It's impractical. The Supreme Court can't take all these cases. So what you have is this muddiness in the law underneath. And that's the problem that they're wrestling with today.
Well, okay, a couple of things. First of all, why is it? Could you make an argument that this isn't punished? Why it's irrelevant? This isn't punishment. This is helping people.
You could make that argument, but if you put them in jail for 30 days as a condition to try to get them into services as a carrot and stick approach, they're going to argue that that's cruel and unusual punishment, or you're criminalizing a status, which is unconstitutional. It's very difficult. And obviously, we've seen the experiment in saying, okay, no one can be compelled to do anything. They can be wherever they want to be for as long as they want to be, and everyone else just has to pay for it. We've seen that in the Western states since 2018. It's not going well. It's not going well for anybody. And it's billions of dollars and endless tax increases. And what about everybody else's rights?
Everyone's talking about this case and the fact that the Supreme Court were taking it up today. Like, this could be the gateway opening to finally solving the homelessness crisis. Is that overstated?
Well, they're likely going to reverse Martin versus Boise, but they're not going to say that cities can do whatever they want to people who are homeless. It didn't sound like they were going to say that. It sounds like they're going to say, under the 14th Amendment, people who have a necessity defense can assert that if they're arrested. It sounded like that's where it's going to go, so that there won't be any punishment. So that it can't be cruel and unusual because it isn't going to exist if people have a necessity defense. I think that's where they're going to go with this, but they're going to take it out of this Robinson versus California thing, because if they overturn Robinson versus California, and they overturn Roe v. Wade, and they change the interpretation of the Second Amendment, this court is very willing. They have 5 votes to correct what they consider to be errors in previous courts. And let me tell you, if they take on the incorporation doctrine, that unsettles a lot of cases. For example, the ruling that said California's prisons were overcrowded,
Oh, yes.
that was under this same decision, under Robinson versus California, incorporated to tell California. And remember, this was 1962. Prior to 1962, the federal judges would have said, we don't have anything to say about that. This is a state matter. But in 1962, the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause was applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. And then, I think it was 2011, the Supreme Court said that California, one of the appeals courts said that California's prisons were overcrowded. And we have seen ever since various laws to try and uncrowd the prisons. and all the consequences that came from that, which I believe Justice Alito warned about, that it was in this divided Supreme Court decision, they were putting people in California at risk of harm by opening
Interesting.
up the prisons.
So it's interesting. That's an aspect of this I hadn't really talked about. We're going to have to leave it there, Susan, for now, and we'll come back and discuss it once we get the ruling, which is not that far away, right? We expect it in June sometime by the end of this session.
By the end of June, I would think, yes.
But the final thing here that's so interesting is that the incorporation clause, which is not something I focused on, it sounds like it really fights the 10th Amendment.
It absolutely does. It
And so
almost repealed the 10th Amendment.
Right. So if you're a 10th Amendment, I don't want to say absolutist, but a 10th Amendment devotee,
Advocate.
like
Yes.
advocate, like I definitely am, then this is very interesting on those grounds, far beyond just the homelessness issue. And you sort of want them to overturn it if you're really pro 10th Amendment. Would that be correct?
Well, if they reverse the whole incorporation doctrine, it's quite a mess. And that's because many, many things have been done through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment through the years, including desegregation. So there's a lot to fix. And the correct way to fix it is with constitutional amendments. But as you know, for the last 100 years or so, everyone's just said, too hard. We'll just go and get a test case at the Supreme Court. And this is why the whole judiciary is now so politicized. And every time a Supreme Court justice retires, the whole country loses its mind over it. It's because we've stopped amending the Constitution and replaced written constitutional amendments with case law, with test cases, with landmark decisions. And that's why it's so contentious.
All right, let's pick it up once we get a ruling, which is in a few weeks' time, probably. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Susan. Really appreciate it. Jen Horn, AM 870, The Morning Answer, Los Angeles and Southern California, and in fact, all over the world, because I go all over the world and people say, I listen to you with Jen Horn and Grant Sinchfield every Friday morning. And
I
which
love
is a great
that.
joy. I know, it's amazing. What's going on, though, where you are in LA? What's going on with the mayor of Los Angeles? This is nightmare for her. Always these sort of incidents.
Yeah, a lot of crazy happening in LA. You know, it's been very funny because Karen Bass has been getting a lot of attention as of late because of her Inside Safe program, and she's been trying to fix the homeless stuff. Yet we've got like these mini mansions like popping up in the middle of the 110 freeway where homeless people have set up these very nice encampments. But this weekend, apparently, I guess for her soft on crime policies, a criminal wanted to personally thank Karen Bass, and at 6:45 in the morning, paid a visit to a little Care Bear who was home and inside. This is very scary, actually. She and her family were inside the house, and this guy breaks in at 6:45 through, it seems like a sliding glass door, maybe a large window, and got into her house. Now, you would think that the mayor should have protection, and I think that the LAPD was there, but maybe somehow this guy got by them. It was early in the morning, so who knows? But he broke into the house, and the LAPD turned out in full force. They even brought in air support. They brought in the helicopters. They were able to arrest the guy. He's 29 years old, a guy who I think probably had a drug issue in the past. And we'll see what his reason was. But it seems odd that this mayor, who tells us that everything is fine and that it's safe to ride the metro and that crime is down, has now been burglarized twice. Steve, in 2 years, because somebody broke into her house 2 years ago when she was running for mayor.
And that was the time when, what was the story there? It was something to do with guns, right? She had guns in the house and they stole the guns. Is that right?
They stole the guns. And that was unusual because she's been such a loud voice against the Second Amendment when she was in Congress. And then she was in Congress at that moment running for mayor of LA, and two people broke into her home and stole two of her guns. And so that became a big story. But I do just think it's worth pointing out because I live in Los Angeles and I have my whole life. And for me, it feels worse now than I think it ever has in terms of crime. You're constantly looking over your shoulder. You're keeping your eyes open. When you have the mayor, again, kind of gaslighting all of us, telling us that everything is fine and that there's no problem, but she herself has been victimized 2 times, you would think that would be the catalyst for her to maybe come out and have a really honest dialogue with the people of Los Angeles that none of us are exempt. Even in the mayor's mansion, none of us are exempt from this problem right now.
It's really interesting because often I tell you the thing it makes me think is it doesn't matter what happens with these ideologues, because one of the critiques that's often made is, well, these luxury liberals, right? With, you know, they're often very wealthy and they live in wealthy neighborhoods, and especially the donors that support the people like George Gascon, you know, billionaires and millionaires giving him money and whatever. They are insulated from the consequences of their ideas and their policies because they
Right.
have protection, they live in mansions, they whatever. So that's one argument you get. And you say, well, and that's the reason that they don't do anything about crime. It doesn't affect them. But actually, here we have someone who is affected. She's been affected twice now. She still doesn't do anything about it either. So, like,
Yeah.
what's going on? Like, you would think that kind of very, very scary. It's a horrible, you know, there's nothing worse in a way. I mean, people often, I think, diminish the seriousness of a break-in and a home invasion if let's say no one was hurt, and say, well, you know, no one's hurt, no one's injured, even if nothing was stolen. It doesn't matter. Your personal space, your absolute sanctuary has been violated. It's
Yeah.
terrifying. You would never think about that the same way ever again. So it's happened to her before. Nothing changed. That was 2 years ago, as you said, nearly 2 years ago. And yet still you have the problem. And if anything, it's growing. So obviously didn't affect her enough to actually change her ideology.
Yes, and I think that's right. And it, even though there wasn't anybody hurt, and thank God for that, because even though I'm not a fan of Mayor Bass, I want to see her safe.
Of
But I
course.
also want to see her do right by the people of LA who don't have the same protections that she does. And if it's happening to her, you know at what scale it's happening to the
Yeah.
rest of us. And I think that even when you are not physically hurt, having someone in your space, my mom was robbed. She had a burglary at her home a few years ago, and it is incredibly damaging. I mean, it makes you look around. You feel like your space, you've had an intruder in your space. And that is not, it's unsettling to say the least, even if there wasn't someone at home or even if there wasn't someone hurt. And I do think that it's important to note, I had something happen this week. I was talking with your producer extraordinaire. I had something happen in my neighborhood this week, pretty significant. There was a murder that happened and my neighbors were trying to call in. They had evidence. The LAPD, Steve, is so overworked. I mean, a piece of evidence that could have been involved in solving a case, it took days for detectives to be able to come out and get it. And they apologized. They said, we're so overwhelmed. We have bodies literally stacking up. It's a lot to sort through. And if you look at how many people are coming out of police academy and going into the LAPD, the number is very low. I think they had 30 in their recent class. You're never going to fill the need for LA County, especially with the soft on crime policies that incentivize this, if we don't set up a system where police officers are going to feel appreciated again. And we're maybe even at some point looking at breaking up the LAPD to make it more manageable. I mean, it's just so huge and it's so big. I don't want to blame law enforcement. I just don't think it's doing its best to be effective for the people. Clearly, we can see that when it hits at home to the mayor's house as well.
Yeah, but look, it's been effective before, hasn't it?
For
I mean,
sure.
I wasn't there, but I do remember years ago when I worked for David Cameron.
Mm-hmm.
And it was before he was prime minister, and we were kind of, you know, doing overseas trips every now and again and meeting overseas leaders and so on. And I think it was I'm pretty sure it was when Bill Bratton was running the LAPD. And, you know, he was famous, obviously, for getting a grip on crime in New York.
Right.
Didn't he do isn't he considered to have
Great.
done a pretty good job in LA?
I miss him. He was one of the best police chiefs I think that we've had. And, you know, I was talking to some officers about Michael Moore. Michael Moore is the police chief who just retired. And a lot of people gave him a bad rap, but many officers actually said that they like him, that he was a good guy, but that he just had too big of a department and there were too many people kind of hiding. The morale is down, right? So officers are just sort of like ready for their next step. They're ready to get out, this kind of thing. And so I think it's hard to blame the problem on one person, but I think it's the combination of all the problems. You've got the soft on crime policies that we always talk about. You have a department that's really big. You have it in recovery of COVID and from the Black Lives Matter movement where people were blaming law enforcement for literally everything. And so now we have a place where people just feel like there's going to be no consequence for any of their actions. And criminals are brazen now, even walking into the mayor's house. They know that this is the mayor's house. So that's what makes it unusual, is that you would have someone at 6:45 in the morning, which is not when you usually see this kind of thing happen, just feel like they can walk into someone's home and yes, he was caught, and yes, he's being held, and yes, he will probably face the consequences. But if this happened to someone else, you have to wonder if they'd feel the same consequences.
And even if it would be reported, I mean, that's the other thing. They keep telling us the crime is down. I mean,
Right.
half the time it's because these things aren't reported. Everyone knows that the police aren't going to come. You know, they don't collect the statistics. It's just it's everything working together, right? Because you've exactly as you say, you've got the three parts of it. You've got the police themselves, you've got the DA's office in terms of prosecution, and you've got political leadership in terms of the mayor. And all of it has been going wrong the last few years. And I mean, if you look at Garcetti, I mean, just that stuff that, do you remember he was on his knee, you know,
Right.
and just is so kind of demoralizing for the police. When you have the person who's supposed to be leading the fight to keep the city safe in terms of representing the people just being utterly pathetic. So you have you have no political leadership. That's demoralizing. You have the DA, Gascon, who's just come in and as we've discussed many times, just say, all right, we're not going to prosecute this. We're not going to prosecute that. Nothing on gangs, nothing on, teenagers who are doing violent crime, just on and on. That's demoralizing because you think, well, why bother? If I'm a police officer, nothing's going to happen anyway. And then the actual management of the police department itself. So all of that has to be turned around. I mean, do you think? I mean, Karen Bass, she's not as bad as Garcetti, is she? In terms of her, I mean, I see her sort of saying things that are
Right.
supportive of law enforcement. Is that fair?
Well, she definitely thanked the LAPD for turning out at her home. I don't think she has been as anti-cop as Garcetti was, especially during 2020. It's hard to tell. I feel like the jury is still out with her. She said a lot of things, but a lot of when she gets questioned about real problems, especially when it comes to crime and homelessness, she always answers with, well, I'm new here. It's, I'm just getting my feet wet. So I guess we have to see, because you've been there now for 2 years. So we want to
Right,
see
you're not that
real
new.
action. Right.
I mean, it just feels like you do need a change there. Like you've got, and actually, hopefully this year we'll get a change in the DA's office.
That's right.
Gascon out. We hope Nathan Hochman in. That would be a really big change, and very quickly. I mean, remember how quickly Gascon turned it all to absolute kind of crap,
to garbage.
Like with his he literally walked in with this manual with all the policy changes, none of which he really talked about in detail before the election. So Nathan Hochman, who's very clearly said how he's going to turn things around. He's very experienced and professional. You could imagine that happening quite quickly because everyone will be with him in the department because they're all against Gascon. So they're crying out for leadership. So I think that could change pretty quickly as long as Nathan Hochman is elected and Gascon's kicked out. On the mayoral front, it feels like, I mean, I don't know what Rick Caruso's plans are. I mean, it's not that far away now. I mean, it feels to me like Karen Bass, not as bad perhaps as what we've seen before, but I think you need a change there.
We need something. And Rick Caruso has been out very publicly criticizing Karen Bass about homelessness particularly. So I do believe he's probably going to run again. But here's what gives me hope in the short term, because I don't have great hope that there's going to be a new mayor in Los Angeles anytime soon. But I do think you're right. I think we have a very good chance of getting Nathan Hochman elected if everybody turns out and if everybody coalesces behind him instead of Gascon. But the other piece that gives me hope is that the news out of the Prop 47 campaign, the amendment,
oh, yes,
that
very good.
They've got 900,000 signatures. If that can get on the ballot in November and it's not too mutilated by the Attorney General, maybe we can start clawing back a little bit of sanity around here.
Yeah, but remember I mean, I agree with you. That's a real step in the right direction, but still it requires a prosecutor to sort of pick up the opportunity that those reforms will provide. Well,
and
can
a
I just
fully
ask
staffed police department.
Exactly. That's the last thing I just wanted to get your take on, which is who's running LAPD now? Is Michael Moore out or said he's
out.
leaving?
Dominic Choi is the interim chief. I don't know how long he will last, but he's going to be interim. Seems like everybody likes him. He just did an interview that was actually pretty interesting. If you get a chance to check it out with Lester Holt, he did it last week, and he talked about the staffing demands. He would like a department that has 12,000 officers, and right now he's at about, I think, 8,800. So significantly short-staffed. And I think even at
That's a lot.
20,000 officers, they'd probably be short-staffed in LA.
Are they looking for a permanent one and he's one of the candidates, or what's the
I think
deal
he's
there?
one of the candidates. I think Karen Bass is kind of letting him kind of get his feet wet right now, but it's my understanding that they might be looking for someone full-time without appointing until they did. He's one of the candidates that would be up for it, I'd imagine.
But again, as we saw with Bratton, someone could, like someone who really knows what they're doing with a clear direction.
Mhm.
And strong leadership, they can make a big difference quickly.
That's right.
All right, well, we'll see. Jen, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. A little bit shorter than usual. You got to rush off, but that's okay. We covered an important story, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Steve.
All right, so here's something I want to get off my chest this week, and it's usually something negative that I'm fired up about, and I'm fed up with some nonsense and ridiculous thing that has just caught my eye. Well, actually, this week I want to say something positive. And I want to say something positive about someone who is increasingly, to me, the leading voice of sanity in our country. And you may find this an unlikely statement for me to make, but that person, as far as I'm concerned, is Bill Maher on his show on HBO, which is, the show's called Real Time. And, I don't know if you watched the show, you may have seen clips of him. I mean, over the years, I think really prompted by the pandemic, he's in California, and he saw the absolute madness of the response to the pandemic. But it's not just that. On every issue now, week after week, he does a little monologue at the end of his show, like roughly 8 minutes. I think it's called New Rules. And it's so impressive because this is someone who's on the left, right? He's always been seen and says proudly he's a Democrat and he's on the left, hates Trump, but he is more than anyone else on the left, I think, standing up to the far left insanity that has just infected the left, as we discussed earlier in the show in the context of the anti-Semitism. And on issue after issue, it's Bill Maher that's standing up to them. On the climate extremism, on crime, on the sort of drift to the far left, woke madness. And this week particularly caught my eye because he waded into like absolutely, dangerous territory if you're on the left, or anyone actually, where he got into the whole question of gender ideology, what's going on with children in particular. We know how toxic that whole debate can be. And what he did, I think, was so important because he laid out some common sense ground rules and did it in a way, of course, he's a comedian, so it's funny, but also very, very serious. Here's a little part of what he said this week.
Wokeness is not an extension of liberalism anymore. It's more often taking something so far that it becomes the opposite. Teaching kids not to hate or judge those who are different, great. Proud we got there, all for that. But at a certain point, inclusion becomes promotion. And contrary to current progressive dogma, children aren't miniature adults wise beyond their years, they're morons. They're gullible morons who'll believe anything and just want to please grown-ups. And they don't have any frame of reference. So they normalize whatever's happening. That's why endlessly talking about gender to 6-year-olds isn't just inappropriate. It's what the law would call entrapment, which means enticing people into doing something they wouldn't ordinarily do. And if you think that some of that isn't going on with gender in schools, you're not watching enough TikTok videos.
I pledge allegiance to the queers.
I'm not allowed to be out as trans non-binary at school. My response to this is to be as obnoxiously queer as possible.
There's a certain kind of activist these days who wants to take heterosexuality, old school, old-fashioned, boring, minding its own business heterosexuality, and lump it in with patriarchy and sexism and racism and tell kids, wouldn't it be cool if you were anything but that? It also seems to be the theme of kind of a lot of kids' books these days. I never used the phrase gay agenda because I thought it was mostly nonsense, and it is, mostly. But a director for Disney Television Animation did say after she was hired,
the showrunners were super welcoming to like my like not at all secret gay agenda. Like I was just wherever I could, just basically adding queerness. No one would stop me, and no one was trying to stop me.
Look, I'm all for adding queerness wherever. I put some in my drink before I came out here tonight. But maybe we should think about giving kids a break from our culture wars for a minute, or at least until the election is over.
Now, I watched that and I thought, wow, that is incredibly brave, because you're on the left, you're there in Hollywood, you're just going to get such abuse for that from people who have accepted this extremism. But that's what's so important about Bill Maher. He stands up against the extremists in his own party. And that is the thing that's missing in the Democratic Party. You just don't see politicians standing up and pushing back. I mean, in the past, you saw when parties drift off to the extremes, you have leaders who say, no, this is no good. We can't do this. We have to come back to common sense, back to the mainstream. I mean, whatever you think of him, that was a role that Bill Clinton performed in the early 90s, another period where the Democrats drifted off to the left. Nothing like as bad as what they are now. But Bill Clinton stood up and said, hang on, we got to focus on reasonable, sensible, mainstream things and do it in a mainstream way. And of course, it paid off for him personally and for the Democrats generally in terms of political success. There's no sign of any of that in the Democratic Party today. They go left, 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 further and further left, and they just go along with it. As I've said, Biden in particular, because he's just a pathetic, weak machine politician who's always drifted along with wherever the power is in his party. And right now, the power is with the extreme left. And so it seems to me that the only person on the left really who's standing up against this, at least in a very, very bold and direct way, is Bill Maher. And so I did want to acknowledge that and just urge all of you to watch him and follow him, because he is out there really making these arguments in a way that is very important, not just for the Democrats, but for the sanity and the well-being of our entire political conversation. All right, everyone, that is the end of our political conversation this week. Hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure you follow us on Apple and Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you check out the Big Ideas Book Club. Really interesting conversation out this week with Benji Backer about the conservative environmentalist movement. And coming up, we've got I think you'll enjoy this one, Liz Truss. Remember her? She was the Prime Minister of the UK. Not for very long. She's going to be with us, maybe longer than she was even Prime Minister. Not quite, for our conversation, but I think you'll enjoy it. And we'll see you back here, of course, for the next episode of The Steve Hilton Show.